Without further ado, I give you Kurt Reisweber of Ashland, Virginia.
Thank you. Yeah, in just a second. I'm just going to talk for a second. So I actually started taking railroad photos in 1967 at age 10. And I couldn't even really tell you today why I got involved, although my father was interested in model railroading, and we did have a layout when we still lived in Pennsylvania. And also his father had worked very briefly as a civil engineer for the New York Central. But anyway, I really was more interested in taking pictures of trains than in doing the modeling, and eventually I amassed a really large collection of maybe 30,000 slides, but I found that it was very hard to get other people to consider them for use in their books. And so ultimately I had to make the decision, if I was going to use my own photos in some way, I was going to have to write books myself. And so I actually have been doing that for the last 20 plus years, although most of it has been in the last 10 years or so. And at this point I have 20 railroad books in print and at least another 7 that are already written and waiting for the publisher. So I've kept pretty busy, and now that I'm retired, that's been very helpful. I worked for Colonial Williamsburg for 41 years and retired from Colonial Williamsburg. I spent, of course, pretty much all that time living in Williamsburg. So I guess really that's about all the to-do, and I know that we don't have an enormous amount of time. Anyway, I could use your...
I was going to say your partner in crime for a lot of this.
Yeah. I could use your help in trying to decide what kind of a show I should try to do for this group if I come back next year. And so I'd be particularly interested in what you think of this show. But I am not even necessarily limited to trains. I do have a number of photos that I've taken of other subjects as well, and I do understand that this is a pretty varied group of people. So in any event, it would be important for me to know if you like this show. However, I do want to point out that this show is set in eastern North Carolina, and eastern North Carolina is not a place that I would consider as a scenic highlight of the country. And so the pictures are somewhat different from the kind of pictures that I would normally show, but I picked this specifically because it was North Carolina. So without further ado then, I guess we'll just proceed. So I'm going to stand back here so I can watch and narrate at the same time. So this first photo shows the Aberdeen and Rockfish Railroad at Fayetteville, North Carolina. And this is the local switcher working in downtown at the yards that are used by the A&R and CSX and Norfolk Southern. This is another photo in Fayetteville. One thing that's very common in Fayetteville are grade crossings where one railroad crosses another, and you can actually see one of those in the foreground. The train at the right was actually a through train that came from Rayford, North Carolina, and turned around and went back at Fayetteville. And here it is again. And again. Now, in this case, they've actually picked up some hopper cars, which they eventually would take back to Rayford with them. As you can see, they interchange in Fayetteville with Norfolk Southern and also with CSX.
Approximately what's the time frame of these?
I would say roughly 2000. This is actually a place where the Aberdeen and Rockfish track crosses the Aberdeen and Rockfish. And you can see how they protect the crossing. This, on the other hand, is a crossing of the Aberdeen and Rockfish and the former main line of the Atlantic coastline, which occurs on the south side of Fayetteville. Now, this is after the train had left Fayetteville, and they are heading towards Rayford at this point. Fayetteville sits in a river valley, and this is at the top of the hill that surrounds the river valley. Then this shows the train at Rockfish, and you can see how the track actually closely follows the layout of the land. When they built the railroad, they didn't invest a lot in cuts or fills. And this is near the top of the main grade on the Aberdeen and Rockfish, which comes out of Rockfish to the west or north. And in this case, they're actually coming uphill with a cut of the train. They have to double the hill when it's a long train. They leave part of the train at the bottom of the hill and take it up the hill in two pieces because they don't have enough power to do the whole train at once.
As I recall, they also have a crazy steep grade coming out of Aberdeen.
Yes, there is also a stiff grade out of Aberdeen. However, the worst, I think, grade out of Aberdeen is actually on the former Norfolk Southern Railway. Okay. And today that's used by the Aberdeen, Carolina, and Western.
Okay, that's even worse than the... Okay, interesting.
I think that it is. It's a very stiff grade. This, again, is at the top of the hill. And they actually had come up the hill first with those hopper cars right behind the locomotives. So here you can see this is actually the second cut of the train. And this is a small location that, frankly, I can't pronounce. So I'm not even going to take a stab at this one. It's on the way to Rayford. Okay, this was the just beyond the top of the hill where they had a siding where they set off the first part of the train and then would go back down the hill to pick up the second part. These are several photos at that same location. And this was on the way back down to Rockfish to pick up the second half of the train. And this was coming uphill with the second half of the train. This was at one time a standard grade crossing sign of the Aberdeen and Rockfish. And then this was at Rayford where they tied up after their day was over. On a later day, this was another train coming up through Rockfish, except it only had 2 cars, so they didn't need to double the hill. Rural Hall is not so far from here, and that is the Yadkin Valley Railroad, which we spent the last couple days looking at, and it has changed quite a bit since these photos were taken. This was at Rural Hall. At that time, Rural Hall was like the headquarters and operational center for the Yadkin Valley Railroad. It isn't anymore, but it was then.
And the Yadkin Valley runs from Rural Hall to
out to North Wilkesboro or up to Mount Airy.
Yep. And these are all photos at Rural Hall for the moment. This was at Roaring River, which more or less was the far, I guess you'd say, western end of the line. At least it was the last place that had a major business on it. And this also is at Roaring River with their main business there in the background. I think this might have been around Donahaw, but I'm not absolutely certain of that. And then this was one of my father's pictures that was taken at Elkin.
I have a question. So is that how much the track was going up in front of the train? In front of the locomotive?
What?
I mean, it looks like the track's not well taken care of.
Well, the tracks were pretty overgrown at that time. They've done a fair amount of work since then, and the track does seem to be not only in better shape, but they seem to be actively improving it. When we were out in the last 2 days, we were seeing a lot of brand new ties ready for installation. So I think they're actually doing pretty well. But at that time, they were, this is a number of years ago, and they were closer to be a startup then. And this was my photo of the same train at Elkin, and you can see downtown Elkin at the left there. And this was at Elkin. 2 days ago, we actually saw that building in the background. There's now a park off to the left out of this view. Now, this was a minor problem that we ran into while we were taking pictures of the trains. This guy tried to cut that a little too tight and ended up in the briar patch. And as you can see, it got in the way of the rail traffic. They did finally get a bulldozer or a front end loader to help them get it out of there. Now this was on the Laurinburg and Southern, which I guess at some point was taken over by this G&O system. And so they had brought in other locomotives from outside the Laurinburg and Southern to run it. This one is the Knoxville and Holston River Railroad, which was one of their properties. And this was a train that we ran into by accident at Rayford while we were following the A&R, and then we followed this train to Laurinburg. These are all photos of the Laurinburg and Southern train between Rayford and Laurinburg.
Not much of a road bed.
No. And that was their standard grade crossing sign.
Says look on it.
Look. Well, they go about 10 miles an hour, so you don't have any trouble keeping up with them. Now, this was in Laurinburg, where, as you can see, they were still using some locomotives in the old paint scheme. And this was the train coming into Laurinburg, which was where the Laurinburg and Southern shops were, such as they were. And so that's why there's a bunch of locomotives sitting over there waiting a call to duty that may never come. This was their miniature locomotive. And then this was at the main customer they had actually in Laurinburg. This was an oddball car that I really don't know much about, except that it looked very strange. The Carolina Coastal Railway initially was running a small branch of the original Norfolk Southern Railway between Pinetown and Belhaven, North Carolina. And these are all some pictures on the Carolina Coastal. This was at Pinetown. At Pinetown, they connected with what was then the later Norfolk Southern, which was running the original Norfolk Southern Railway track at that location at that time. This is the very colorfully named Cuckold's Creek Bridge, which is just on the outskirts of Belhaven. This is one of my father's photos. And here again is one of my father's photos showing the locomotive, which is a re-engined Baldwin switcher handling some cars back towards Pinetown. This is another one of my father's photos. This is scenery very typical of eastern North Carolina. Now, in this day, we were waiting near Pinetown for the train to come, and in this case, it wasn't really a train, it was just a locomotive. But anyhow, the locomotive, we could see it in the distance approaching, and then all of a sudden, it seemed like it wasn't moving anymore, and then the headlight turned off. So we figured maybe something was wrong, and we drove down to where the locomotive was, and it turned out the locomotive had broken down. And the interesting part about this, though, is that the crew on this locomotive was trying to reach a mechanic at Pinetown by radio. And the mechanic, who was busy working on another locomotive, wasn't responding. And so that left them sort of marooned out in the middle of nowhere. And they asked us to provide them with a ride back to Pinetown so they could talk to the mechanic, which in fact we did. Now this is at Pinetown, and as you can see, at that point the track was slightly visible. This is at Belhaven, which was the end of the line. Belhaven was on a river, and actually at one point small steamboats used to tie up there. This is also at Belhaven. And here again is the locomotive on its way back to Pinetown, and again you can see that's not exactly mainline track. And this is approaching Pinetown. Now, there was a day when we were out on the Carolina Coastal that they weren't running any trains, but they did run the weed sprayer. And so we actually ended up following the weed sprayer, and I can only begin to imagine what they thought of us. But anyway, here is the weed sprayer on its way to Belhaven, and here it is at Cuckold's Creek in Belhaven. So later the Carolina Coastal expanded quite a bit, and they acquired a lot of additional former Norfolk Southern Railway track between Plymouth and basically Raleigh by way of Chocowinity, and this is at Washington, North Carolina, in case you didn't recognize where Backwater Jack's is. This was also the Carolina Coastal after it had expanded, and at that point they were using this owned or leased or borrowed SD9 or SD18 that had originated with the Duluth, Mesabi, and Iron Range. This is at Wilson.
Does it still have an arrowhead on it?
I don't think it did then, no. They were also using these locomotives that had been a part of a lease fleet run by the Livingston, Montana locomotive shops. The North Carolina and Virginia begins with a connection with the Seaboard Railroad at Boykins, Virginia, and then goes down on a former Seaboard Airline branch until it reaches the Atlantic coastline route between Rocky Mount and Portsmouth. And then it turns hard through Ahoskie, North Carolina, and goes to a brand new steel mill at Tunis, North Carolina. And this is one of their locomotives that had originated with the Chesapeake and Ohio. This is also the North Carolina and Virginia more or less. And this was at Ahoskie. And here again we have a view at Ahoskie. That is the headquarters and operations center for the North Carolina and Virginia. They have the old Atlantic Coastline station at this location. This was actually at the steel mill at Tunis, and it shows something of the track layout. Of course, all this track was actually built new after the steel mill was built. This is at Boykins, which is actually just over the border in Virginia, and it shows that they had actually added a couple of tracks to serve as a yard there for their interchange with CSX. This is back to Ahoskie, and you do sort of have to wonder about the maintenance of their American flag on the sand tower.
Looks like it's an FEC engine, looks like.
The lineage of that, is that?
That's an old Florida East Coast locomotive. As you can see, the North Carolina and Virginia would use any power they could get their hands on, and this is a set that came from somewhere, but of course the rear unit is actually a slug.
With dynamic brakes, which is kind of unusual.
Looks like they were still using the fuel tank too. And as you can see, it was an Operation Lifesaver slug. This is at the port of Morehead City, North Carolina. My father organized the Norfolk and Southern Railway Historical Society, and he actually arranged for a couple of tours of the port facility that were centered on their rail activities. And so this was a part of a tour that was given for the Norfolk and Southern Railway Historical Society. The locomotive belonged to the Port Authority. The Beaufort and Moorhead Railroad originally was a separate company, and it extended the track from Moorhead City originally to Beaufort, North Carolina, which was a very, very short distance. And this was probably their last locomotive acquired. It was acquired secondhand. And as you can see, it says B&M Railroad on it. This was sort of their paint scheme, and it was probably the last new piece of equipment they got, although they didn't get it brand new. Now here we see that the Port Authority, for a very brief time, had a preference for Fairbanks Morse locomotives. And so they ended up buying a few second or third hand. This is one of them, and they painted them in the paint scheme of the Pittsburgh and West Virginia Railroad.
And I think we found out Saturday night, this unit is now at Spencer.
Oh, boy. Is it a former Milwaukee or CNW?
No, it was the last thing that it was before the port bought it was some sort of an industrial.
Okay.
They've actually operated at Spencer.
And there's another view of it. And here it is again, and off to the right you can see the drawbridge that used to lead from Moorhead City to Beaufort, and the Beaufort and Moorhead Railroad.
Is that still in place?
The drawbridge is still there, but it isn't used very often. They have a small yard on an island on the far side of that drawbridge, and it's sometimes used to store freight cars, but that seems to be about it. The Aberdeen and Briar Patch. And as I said at the program on Saturday, it says a new service with an old tradition, and in this case, the old tradition was bankruptcy. Of course, this track was actually then later taken over by the Aberdeen, Carolina, and Western, and they have made a fantastic success out of it. But at that time, there were no feed mills at Candor, and so there was very, very little freight traffic. Now this is a really odd one. This would be probably a 1980s or 90s photo of the office building of the Virginia and Carolina Southern Railroad at Lumberton, North Carolina. And as you can see, the railroad was out of business then and had been for a long time. In fact, I'm not even sure they ever had diesels. This was at Becker Sand and Gravel in Lillington, North Carolina.
Do you think that last station, that was a Jim Crow station? That was the reason for the two entrances?
It might have been, but I really couldn't say for sure. I don't even really know much about what kind of passenger service the Virginia and Carolina Southern might have had. It's possible it was like a mixed train daily sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And there's Becker Sand and Gravel again. Now at this point it didn't appear to me that they were using any rail service at all. And the locomotive, as you can see, was just sitting off in the weeds. Okay, on the Aberdeen, Carolina, and Western, this is Oakboro, which is, I guess, well, it's somewhere west of Star and east of Raleigh. That's probably the best description I can give. Oakboro isn't a very big place, and for a while the AC&W had a locomotive that they stationed there, and a crew would show up every day and run either east to Mount Gilead, North Carolina, or west to Raleigh, as the case might be. And this was a case where they were just starting up for the day. This was a trip where they actually went west to Charlotte. Now, I understand that things have changed drastically in that area now, but at that time there was very minimal freight traffic on the west end of the former Norfolk Southern Railway into Charlotte. As you can see here, there's only like a couple of freight cars, maybe 3. I think that was at Stanfield, North Carolina. And then this, of course, is at Charlotte. My father and I had actually visited Charlotte in the late 1960s, and I can guarantee it didn't look anything like that. This train is actually diverging onto the former Norfolk Southern Railway track to go back to Oakboro, and you can see they've got 4 freight cars there. The Southern Railway main line is at the right. And the wires are above. What?
The Southern Passenger Station is, if you could see the details, you could probably see it down there on the right of the main line there. The Amtrak station.
Yes, that's right. The station is down there. And then this is another view looking in the other direction, which had no wires. But in any event, they're heading back to Oakboro. So this is at Candor, which has changed a lot since this photo was taken. The AC&W has now built a shop building and headquarters that's on the other side of that street there. But at this time, they were still headquartered at Star, and they kept a couple of locomotives at Candor to do the run from there to Aberdeen. And here again, we're at Candor. And again at Candor. At Candor, there are 2 large customers, very large customers. Purdue is one, and the other one I think is called Mount Air, but they're both feed mills. And they get incoming grain, which comes in whole train loads. And here they are working the Mount Air feed mill, and in the distant background on the left is the Purdue facility.
I used to travel that road, 211 right there.
What?
I used to travel that road, 211 beside this.
Uh-huh.
And so I've seen their shops.
Uh-huh.
I've seen also the main building. And what I predominantly saw was the white and green engines, and it was heavily traveled with all of these grain farms.
Yes, it's changed quite a bit in the last few years. You can see the last couple of locomotives here are in that green and whitish paint scheme. And at this point, they're using a lot of 6-axle power, particularly because of that heavy grade that comes out of Aberdeen. At this time, the train speed was, like 10 miles an hour or something, maybe 20. And so, again, we had no trouble keeping up with the train. This is at Pinehurst, where the track actually goes through the golf course. This was one of my father's photos of that same train, and it shows the clubhouse off to the right.
there's a string of bar cars there right now where you take your picture. And,
Yes, that's right.
It's pretty wild.
Now this was at the top of the hill that from this point leads downhill into Aberdeen. And this is the train coming into Aberdeen. Originally there would have been a Y at this location, but now one of the legs is severed. This is where the AC&W interchanges with CSX on the former Seaboard airline. And here we are at Aberdeen alongside the rather sad-looking main track of the former Seaboard airline. The signals had been taken out of service and it was all jointed rail on the Seaboard, and it's just sad. So this was on the way back on a trip where they had a locomotive leading that had had some work done in the cab area, and it looked like the Gray Ghost. This is coming into Pinehurst. And again, this is at Pinehurst. You can see the golf course at the right. Now you can go pretty quickly through the roster photos at Star, but there was just a ton of different junk at Star, so we'll just go through that rather quickly. The United States Navy boxcar, evidently they'd bought a few of those. You can speed up a little more. This was all just stuff sitting around at Star. This is some more of their more modern paint scheme, but again, these are not 6-axle units, so they may very well have been replaced by now.
What year was that, approximately?
Well, this was before 2007, because my father was with me then, and he was still obviously alive then, so I would guess this was around 2000, 2001, somewhere in there.
2006 or 2016.
Doesn't seem real likely. My father was pretty sick by 2006, so. But it's theoretically possible. The best thing I could say right now would be early 2000s without looking at the slides. These are two cabooses that I say fell into green. And here we are out on the line at Candor again. And this is Pinehurst again with the clubhouse in the background on the right. This guy's working up a thirst. And this is coming into Aberdeen again, and the track in the foreground is the former main line of the seaboard. And here's the train coming back out of Aberdeen at Pinehurst again. This was going downhill to Star from the branch.
It really goes downhill at that point.
It looks like it's sinking into the ground.
And this was a Candor, I think. I think that's the Candor station in the background. This was coming into Candor. So this was at Oakboro again on a different day. This was the day they ran the train east, and this is approaching Solite. Here's another view approaching Solite. And this is on the Hydro, North Carolina bridge over the PD River. With a dam on the PD River in the background. You can see at that time they didn't have an enormous amount of freight traffic there. This was at Mount Gilead, which was as far east as they were going, because that's where the main customer was. And then here they are heading back towards Oakboro with 3 loads. This was on the way by Hydro. This is at Norwood, where the former Norfolk Southern Railway crossed over the track of the Winston-Salem southbound. And this is at Solite again, where they actually have a customer, and they did stop to make a pickup there. This is also at Solite. The customer is in the background. This is not a standard grade crossing sign. So while my father was still alive, he set up a fan trip on the AC&W for the Norfolk and Southern Railway Historical Society, and this is some photos from that event.
You know anything about the car in the middle?
I don't know anything about these heavyweight cars, but I do know the lightweight cars. The lightweight cars are originally Pennsylvania Railroad congressional cars that were built by Budd in the 1950s, and they were used between Boston and Washington, or between New York and Washington. And this particular set of 2 cars is actually the kitchen lounge at the nearest part, and the dining section is at the farther part. So the people working in the kitchen actually would have to take the food through the vestibule to get it to where the diners were. And this, as you can see, is its star while we were loading the train. And I was riding that train, of course. This was a shot taken on the gondola with picnic tables, or cocktail tables, depending on how you use them, I guess. This, I think, is actually at Candor. And then here we are again. This is the railroad version of a party barge. And this was the photo run by. Okay, on mainline railroads, we have some interesting things. This is a CSX train on its way back from the phosphate plant at Lee Creek, North Carolina, which was originally served by the Norfolk Southern Railway, and now CSX has trackage rights to get there. So this is actually a CSX train on former Norfolk Southern Railway trackage. And here we are at Phosphate Junction, which is just across the river from Washington, North Carolina. This is at Wilson, North Carolina, at Contentia Junction. And the track in the foreground is the original Wilmington and Weldon Railroad route to Wilmington, North Carolina from Wilson. And the cutoff that was built later is where the train is. That goes from Wilson to a point near Florence, South Carolina. And here are several photos at Wilson at Contentia Junction, which is on the south side of Wilson. Now, Fayetteville, again, is a really stupendous railroad town from my point of view. And there's all kinds of stuff going on there. In this case, the train is on the main line of the former Atlantic coastline and is crossing the track of the former Cape Fear and Yadkin Valley, which at that point is still in use by CSX. And by Norfolk Southern. We'll come to that a little bit later. So here's another train at Fayetteville crossing the Cape Fear and Yadkin Valley track. This is downtown Fayetteville, and it just seems like to me that the trains don't really observe the traffic lights. And here we are with a nice colorful cement mixer.
Photobombed it.
Yeah. Yeah, I carry that with me as a prop. So this is on the track of the original Cape Fear and Yadkin Valley on the east side of Fayetteville. And this is a place where the track goes down the middle of the street with the eastbound lanes right in front of me, and the westbound lanes on the other side of the track. And here's a actual revenue run on that same piece of track. This is crossing the former main line of the Atlantic coastline. As we'll see later, Norfolk Southern trains actually use that track under trackage rights. Another southbound coming by the station at Fayetteville. And there is the station at Fayetteville. And here is an Amtrak train stopping with a taxi alongside. This is south of the station a little bit, but not very far. You can't go too far in Fayetteville without running into a railroad track of somebody's. This is a very freshly painted United States Navy boxcar, and it was one of a series, as we see here.
At a time when you didn't see any graffiti on the rail cars.
And a surplus of white paint.
This is open palette for what happens today. These cars wouldn't last very long, solid white.
This is at Pembroke, North Carolina, where the former Atlantic coastline crossed the former Seaboard Airline track between Wilmington and Charlotte at grade. This is on the former Seaboard Airline at Aberdeen. And this was the back end of that same train. This is on the former Seaboard at Hoffman's, which is not so far from Hamlet. And this is a train coming east out of Hamlet, headed towards Wilmington, but it's actually fairly close to Hamlet at this point. This is the same train passing a cemetery at Laurinburg that is not experiencing perpetual care. This was at Goldsboro. I think that this would have been a crossing of the Atlantic coastline and the Atlantic and North Carolina Railroad. And there you can see how they actually had a grade crossing in the foreground there, and that device was intended to control traffic across that crossing. I would assume it's not there anymore. This is at Rocky Mount on the former Atlantic coastline. That's another place where you have a track going right through the middle of downtown. This was the train from Lee Creek approaching Chocowinity, North Carolina, on the original Norfolk Southern Railway track. And this is at Rocky Mount, showing the former Atlantic coastline shops on the left. That was actually a very large shop complex in its day. some of it appeared to be of almost the same vintage as the shops in Burlington. You can see the part on the right there has a lot of fancy brickwork, and we actually went into it since it was standing there abandoned and found that there were actually brick archways inside the building. This is at North Weldon, North Carolina. And this is at Morehead City. The port facility is stretching back into the distance here. And at that time, Norfolk Southern actually kept a switcher there in town, but they have since, for the most part, dispensed with that. And most switching in town is done by the Port Authority's locomotives. This is the Norfolk Southern train leaving Morehead City in the late afternoon. And again, this is a place where the track is right in the middle of the highway with the main street of Morehead City on both sides of the track. That's Morehead City. This is the train when it finally arrived in New Bern. And this is also in New Bern, and you can see that at that time the main traffic on this route was made up of aviation fuel, jet fuel for the Marine Corps Air Station near Havelock. This is also at New Bern, only this is the original Norfolk Southern Railway trestle, which is roughly a mile long. This is the bridge over the Neuse River. And this is the yard at New Bern. That's also the yard at New Bern. This is at High Point.
Early North Carolina train.
This is at Washington, North Carolina, crossing the Pamlico River.
That's a swing bridge.
Yeah, you can actually start running through these, but the truss bridge in the background is actually a drawbridge, and it has to be opened and closed manually. Or at least it was then. I don't know if it's been changed since. Of course, this track is now part of what's operated by the Carolina Coastal Railway.
That commodity is the agricultural limestone out of Tennessee. It was the biggest commodity in there. It's what kept the branch line to Belhaven alive.
Now the riprap in the foreground that's building up the right-of-way here alongside the river is actually made up mostly of concrete ties that were pulled off of the phosphate branch by Norfolk Southern and reused as riprap. This is a train after it had left Washington, but it had not gotten very far along. They're headed towards Plymouth. And this actually is a little out of sequence, but this was the same train on its way back from Plymouth, coming by Pinetown, where it connected at that time with the Carolina Coastal. And this, of course, is the Carolina Coastal locomotive, leased on the left at Pinetown. This is at Washington on the way back. That's actually very near Backwater Jack's Tiki Bar. This is at Walla Wata. And this is in the yard at Chocowinity. This train is approaching Phosphate Junction, and you can see the track in the foreground is actually the Lee Creek branch to the phosphate plant. And this is on the bridge at Washington, North Carolina, but this is from the other end, which takes some walking to get to. This is near Varina, and this is the westbound train out of Varina, headed in the direction of Brickhaven. This is at Corinth. And also around Corinth. This is at the brick plant at Colon, and you can certainly get a feel for why the original Norfolk Southern built a freight office there from brick.
And that's also the place I was telling you about earlier. That's where the short line is going to interchange with CSX as a Colon.
Uh-huh. Now they use the same locomotive set of locomotives twice every day, and this is the early morning part of the day when they would run from Varina to Fayetteville, and then in the afternoon they would go west out of Varina for however far they needed to go. So this train is actually on its way to Fayetteville, and this is at Lillington. And this is at Lillington. Now this was a car in use at the Kelly Springfield tire plant, and I think it was actually carrying rubber. They had a number of these in service there. And this was actually shot at the Kelly Springfield tire plant near Fayetteville. And then here is the train actually curving onto Hillsborough Street in Fayetteville. And in this case, there isn't even a median for the track to go in. It just goes right down the middle of the street. And also, it does not observe the traffic light. Now, in this case, they actually had to stop to wait for permission by the CSX dispatcher to move onto the CSX track for their trackage rights. And so they were actually just sitting there in the middle of the street waiting to come onto the CSX line. And once they got permission to move, then they moved on down into downtown near where the yard was, or is. And this was heading out of Fayetteville on their way back, crossing the main line of the Atlantic coastline. This was on the east side of Raleigh and was an approach signal for the crossing of the seaboard at Glenwood. And this is actually at the crossing. The track going crossways in the foreground is the seaboard main line originally. Okay, I guess that's it.
Very